So that's Ted over there. He's our master button. Welcome to the Friday morning session. Our first speaker, Glen Gordon, medical doctor. He was the first physician in the United States given approval to study pulsed electrical energy for soft tissue injuries. It's a very significant technology. It's cheap, it's easy to administer, and incredibly effective. For 2 years, this also involved photobiology, and then in 1982, he went over to infrared pulsed EMF research. His medical doctorate degree comes from Creighton University. He was a former fellow at the National Institute for Health in Clinical Chemistry in the Department of Clinical Pathology. He was at Pacific Lutheran University for 25 years. That's up in Puget Sound, where he still lives. He told me he's retired and laughed, and I think that's a great way to be. He's the medical director of a biotech transfer company called M-Probe Technologies, and they have a website and all kinds of good information, and he's going to be presenting now. So please welcome Dr. Gordon.
Good morning. This is probably the most diverse group I've spoken to in 25 years of speaking, and of nearly 500 talks that I guess I've given at some time. Who keeps track at that point? I'd like to speak to you this morning about the limits, exploring the limits. Let's see if we get this. Exploring the limits of electromagnetic healing. And I guess that since we're talking about exploring the limits, probably none better than NASA to cite, since they in fact have just completed and not yet published, at least in the lay literature or to the lay media, the most comprehensive study ever done on therapeutic electromagnetic technology, the use of it, defining what the effective parameters are, and studying the various types of energy presentation, i.e. sine wave, DC current, triangular pulse, square wave pulse. And after $3.5 million in 4 years, they have truly brought out what I believe to be the watershed paper in this technology. As American citizens, you might be interested to know that the United States is the only industrialized nation in the world that does not widely use this technology in the treatment of their populace in their countries. This technology has been sorely restrained by vested interests in this country since 1950, and I can assure you I have been a personal witness to that success by these vested interests since 1980, when in fact I did become the first physician in the US to use this on humans in soft tissue injury. If we look at EMF efficacy, we have this NASA study, and I'd like to step outside. I presume this thing is working well. and if not, I hope you can hear me anyway. The NASA study in 2000, which was released in 2003, is available at the NASA website, Lyndon Baines Johnson Center, and the gentleman presenting that study is Tom Goodwin. And this is his study, 33 pages, the physiologic and molecular genetic effects of time-varying electromagnetic fields on human neuronal cells. Now, when I was in medical school, they told us that there was absolutely nothing that could stimulate neurons to grow. That's one of the fallacies I learned in medical school. In any case, what they found, and that work, the engineering work, the physics work, was done by another fellow, Robert Dennis, who was an MIT, established investigator at MIT, and when Goodwin, who was a graduate of the postdoc programs at the University of Michigan, brought this study to his old alma mater, they recruited Robert Dennis to cooperate in it. What Dennis found in terms of the physics and the engineering was that in terms of stimulating this neuronal cell line, dB over dt, or the rate of change, was the key factor in bioefficacy. And in fact, he stated that cells respond to the rate of change in the micromagnetic field, dB over dt, not to the peak field strength or to total flux exposure. Now, as a clinician, I would have some argument with Dennis's stand about total flux exposure. I have treated more patients with this technology than any physician in the United States, over 20,000 patients. I was in sports medicine, and I basically spent 25 years using it to treat musculoskeletal injury and other soft tissue problems, and primarily pain and healing associated with acute injury. Nevertheless, I have treated over 4,000 patients with chronic dense and ordinary connective tissue problems such as low back pain, knee osteoarthritis, and things of that type. Dennis and Goodwin found that sine wave and DC were not an efficient presentation, but they found that square wave and delta wave was. And of course, when we went into this in the 1980s, I had a brilliant engineer who worked with me, and he said, Glenn, the most singly important thing that you can do with your pulse, we had decided at that point we were not going to do CW, sine wave. We were thought for a while about pulse modulating sine wave, but you can't fool something with 200 million years of intelligence, and living systems can pick that out. And so we went to a square wave, and when we went to the square wave, he said, you will need to have the rise time in this square wave as rapid as you can. Our rise time is 8 nanoseconds. We have really worked hard to develop the fastest rise time in the world. The other thing that they discovered, or that they concluded, and if you go to the site and you look at their study, there's nothing equivocal about their conclusions. They said this technology is useful in developing transplant tissue, restoring trauma. I took a very great sigh of relief when I saw that, because I spent 25 years of my life thinking that I could, and this study certainly proved it. And then, of interest to all of us, they felt that it would be very useful in neurodegenerative disorders. And I can tell you now that we are a biotech transfer company, that we are successfully intervening. I'm no longer doing a lot of research. This takes my full time. We are successfully intervening in... Somebody should have given me a hammer. We have been very successful in intervening, at least in the fugue state that occurs in Parkinson's patients in the morning. We now have a small series of patients who are telling us that their mental alertness, their executive capacity is improving with very limited treatment. Actually, we treat them about an hour a day, but we ask them to treat daily. The output, you may ask, what is our output? Our output is 2 Gauss. What has been shown to be bioeffective are are field strengths as low as 70 milligauss. Now what happens with this, and this is the work of Reba Goodman at Columbia University. She was the first one to show that the DNA actually has electromagnetic responsive areas right in the DNA. It does not involve somatic DNA loci. It does involve restorative and growth locations, however. So what you can do with DNA is you can go in and stimulate DNA with a pulsed electromagnetic field, and you will get about a 40% increase in growth hormone synthesis. Now that's important to people who have ischemic heart disease, because if you can stimulate an endothelial cell and cause an increase in growth hormone in an endothelial cell, it will develop vessels, small blood vessels. And that's one of the applications that is being studied very much. The mechanism for what we saw in this, we believe there are two mechanisms that are in play here. One is the ability to quench free radicals, and then the other, of course, is to stimulate these DNA locations responsible for growth hormone and heat shock protein, things like that. Arrhenius, around the turn of the century, said that, and all you rate reaction chemists certainly ought to appreciate him, he's your godfather. Arrhenius said that concentration and temperature were not the only two things that determined a reaction rate. In addition to that, there was a consideration called steric positioning. And that became the basis for the DNL type of chemistry and a lot of other things. We believe that a pulsed electromagnetic field in the presence of paramagnetic species, and all oxygen-based compounds are paramagnetic, and free radicals, naturally occurring free radicals, are all oxygen-based. Now, in addition to that, naturally occurring antioxidants all contain transitional metals. And I needn't tell very many of you that transitional metals are also paramagnetic. So we have two paramagnetic species here. Free radicals are responsible for, now this is a gulp, but please accept it, it's mainstream medicine today. Free radicals are responsible for all aging, illness, injury, and death. It's a paradox in our life, but if you think about it, probably reasonable. I spoke to some last evening, that molecular oxygen is a basis for life, and atomic oxygen is a basis for aging and death. It's the double-edged sword that all of us as physiologists, or who have ever worked as physiologists, certainly begin to appreciate very early in our careers. So we believe that this electromagnetic field is capable, well, we don't believe it, it's now been demonstrated that electromagnetic field is capable of controlling spin, electron spin, and creating a correct steric presentation to allow the neutralization of these free radicals by antioxidants. Free radicals occur in seconds. If you have a heart attack, free radicals are measurable in your coronary sinus in 14 seconds. So if anybody starts to talk to you about a technology that treats proteins or treats cytokines or does things like that, they're clear off the page to someone talking to you about a technology that treats a secretory activity that occurs in 14 seconds. And that's what our technology does. We have the capacity, proven, to quench free radicals, to act as a catalyst, to increase the ability of antioxidants to do it. Our technology doesn't do it. It acts as a catalyst to allow it. And then this is Reba Goodman's work on growth and repair, where she showed, so these are the mechanisms that are now proven today to be in existence. There certainly may be others. You know, this is a 200 million year old energy that's been around with these living cell systems since they incorporated mitochondria inside the cell and went to oxygen respiration. So it's been around a very long time. There certainly may be other things. This is sort of a pictorial. We believe that this pulsed electromagnetic energy is dynamic, it's pulsed, it penetrates. The question becomes, if you calculate it, we think that it penetrates 4 to 5 centimeters. But how low a field strength is still effective. 200 milligauss, 70 milligauss are still effective. And at the skin surface, we're emitting about a 2 Gauss field. In any case, this is nanosecond technology that penetrates living skin. Now, when we first started in this field, and one of the beauties of this study by NASA was that they actually studied electromagnetic radiation, and that included photobiology, the electromagnetic flux that we have that's somewhere between infrared and microwave, and they also looked at microwave technology, and they found this commonality across these electromagnetic energies. If it was sine wave or DC, it was much less or not effective. If it was triangulated or square waved, it was more effective. But rise time, rate of change was the critical factor. As I said, I personally have some questions about their total flux exposure not being important. Certainly clinically, I see it as a very important component of this technology. So this is part of some sales stuff. It just simply shows that these things will penetrate through. And photobiologic, now what we did early on and what changed our mind, my physicists and our engineers were always saying, Glen, you've got this wrong. That low-level laser is not doing anything. That light beam can't get through the skin. And I'd sit there and I'd say, oh no, you guys got this wrong. Well, finally they took me into a physics lab and they took a spectrophotometer and they got to the wavelength, they got to the wattage output. They collimated it very nicely. And then we went into the bottom of a hospital and we got radical breast specimens. And we got a cuvette that was 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. And then they stood there and made me watch how much of the light came through that 1 centimeter specimen that had intact skin in it. And do you know how much came through? 0.02%. Well, they made a believer out of me, and at that point, I said, okay, what do you think is doing it? And they said, we think it's the near magnetic field that's coming out of that electrical circuit that is activating that low-level laser. What we did then is we took some stainless steel tape, you know, the stainless steel body tape that car people can use. We taped over the laser diodes. We continued to treat patients. We continued to look at red blood cell membrane kinetics, potassium channeling principally, and we saw no change. Absolutely no change. So the biologic effect we began to accept was really pulse electromagnetic fields. At about the same time, Stanford University had a wonderful fellow down there named Kendrick Smith. Kendrick wrote one of the watershed papers on photobiology. I argued with him he asked me to review it, and I argued with him for 8 months before he published it. And I'm happy to say that their department today is studying non-photobiologic pulse electromagnetic fields. So I think many of us started out with that. The Russians had certainly championed it, and then we switched over to the non-photobiology. This is a free radical, just to show you something about the steric positioning. And again, I mean, you know, this is sales stuff. If you see that there's only one surface available on this free radical and one surface available on that antioxidant, which would be called their reactive surface, then it's a fairly defined process. Unfortunately, in the human body, as you'll see, 5 hits 3, 3 hits 2. This is a random process where they simply collide. What they're basically doing in those collisions, I needn't tell you, they're building up activation energy so that when this face hits this face, it can occur. With an electromagnetic field, all of the collision energy is not required. You simply bring them around and they hit like this. So this ratio, if this is an 8-sided molecule, this ratio goes from 1 to 64 down to 1 to 1. And we believe this is the way it happens. It acts as a catalyst. It corrects alignment. This allows neutralization of these free radicals. Inflammation stops. Now in wound healing, in inflammation, in injury, until you stop inflammation, you cannot begin to heal. I tell people, if you're a welder, it's like dropping goose poop instead of a nice straight line. You just never get it done. In arthritis, what happens, if you attempt to heal when this inflammation is still present, you get these ectopic bone formation. You get these things that break off in the joint. It's poorly structured bone to start with, and it's It's placed incorrectly, it's laid down incorrectly, and all it does is create further inflammation, further joint destruction. And we are now finding, there's been a very good study done by Deborah Chiambor from Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, that has shown that in fact, in osteoarthritis, this technology is disease modifying. Gentlemen, when they said antibiotics were disease modifying, gentlemen and ladies, when they said antibiotics were disease modifying in pneumonia, it was one of the biggest finds in the history of medicine. It was the onset of the antibiotic era. Have you heard anything about pulsed electromagnetic fields? It's a technology, not a drug, and that's why you haven't heard about it. And we will continue not to hear about it in the United States, I promise you. Well, here's what happens with what we call constitutive responses and transcriptive responses. A constitutive response is secretory. It's the formation of lactic acid. It's the formation of free radicals. They are immediate. They happen now. Transcriptive responses require the RNA-DNA cycle, ribosomal synthesis, and it takes time. So if you have an injury, everything in life is a time-varying equilibrium between these free radicals and these antioxidants, if you just want to make it very simplistic. It's only downstream that it becomes a lot more complicated. When you start activating cytokines and begin to activate enzymes and proteins, then it gets a lot more complicated, but it is a different injury. So if you go beyond about the 12-hour period, you now have cytokines, proteins, enzymes, white cells, and everything else involved in this injury, and you no longer have the capacity to treat that injury as effectively as you could when it was still a constitutively based injury. Do I have proof of that? Absolutely. I have double-blind study after double-blind study on ankle sprains in high school athletes, and I can tell you that the studies last to about an N of 6 before the results break the code. The kids we treat walk into the office the next day. The kids we don't treat come into the office on their parents' shoulders, hobbling on one foot, or using a crutch or a cane. How many would you have to see before you could figure out that's active, that's sham? Doesn't take very long. So what happens here, if the time-varying equilibrium remains constant, then you simply go through the process of aging, and you die eventually. If you have an illness or an injury, and the constitutive response outstrips this transcriptive response, then you go right up through illness and injury, right into stunning. Stunning is that period of time when you are neither alive nor dead. The cells are not dead, but they are not functioning. And this is a clinical aphorism where doctors, since the dawn of medicine that I know of, the old picture of the doctor standing in the kitchen door with the father of the family saying, "We'll know when morning comes. We'll know in the morning." That's about 12 hours. What's the DNA, RNA, ribosomal, transcriptive cycle? About that. When you go in the emergency room and your mother or father or some member of the family has had a stroke or a heart attack, the doctors will say, "We'll know in 12 hours. There you go. So that's basically what happens. If you reestablish the time-varying equilibrium up here, when the sun comes up in the morning, the family member begins to come back down through this injury or illness, and someplace in here goes back to a process of aging, and we die. If they don't, they slip on over the line and they're dead. That all happens prior to the time transcriptive ability is really kicked into gear. And so this technology is very important because it plays in this first 12 hours. Now, Reba Goodman says it also affects this part too. But again, it's an energy that's been around for a couple of 100 million years. You'd expect living systems to take advantage of it in that fashion. Hey, if it works here phenomenologically, why wouldn't I consider using it over here as well? Eastern Bloc countries, this is where it started. Russia and Hungary. There was a guy named Mester, perhaps some of you are even familiar with his name. did some of the early work in this. In the United States, Bob Becker at Syracuse University wrote The Body Electric. I'm sure many of you know about it. It became a cult book to many of us, all of us, I think, that were interested in this at all. The low-level lasers were continued. We took them on first in 1980. They continued in the veterinarian field and in the humans. As a matter of fact, there's a fellow named Ron Wynett who is a senior photobiologist at FDA. FDA is still studying it. In 1980, Dave Lytle, who was one of their photobiologists, said, this technology is not bioeffective. I argued with him until we did our work in 1982, came back to FDA and said, we agree with Dave Lytle. Low-level lasers are not effective on the basis of the photobiologic output. FDA is still studying them, still studying them. Now in the 1980s, pulse magnetic fields are used worldwide. 2000, the United States. In 1980, I actually had to pay to get Russian and Hungarian articles translated. There were no English articles. In the year 2000, if you go into PubMed at the National Library of Medicine, you will find somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 articles in English, depending upon how you key your search. So we clearly lead the world in research in this technology. Columbia University is one of the primary centers. Stanford University is another. But there's work being done all over the United States. University of Indiana School of Medicine has an excellent department. University of Utah has a good department, as a matter of fact. They also do quite a bit of electromagnetic research out here. So the reason for this I probably have this out of sync, but the reason for this free radical thing is these magnetic domains, ferromagnetic, paramagnetic, and diamagnetic. Paramagnetic species increase their reaction rate in a magnetic field. That's not my statement. That's a statement by a guy named Zumdahl, who has a textbook of chemistry written and published at the University of Illinois. I suggest anybody that wants to read a very good book can look at his chapter on that. So reaction rate becomes a function of concentration, temperature, and steric alignment. Free radicals are constitutive, they rise immediately. Antioxidants are transcriptive, goes back to the we'll know in 12 hours. So pulse magnetic fields basically take on board antioxidants and can make them. This is Stanford's. That number is Stanford. A guy named Eichwald at Stanford did that discovery, or did that work, said that they could make antioxidant enzymes up to 100 times more effective. Boy, if you've got an injury, or if you're sick, that'll make you feel one hell of a lot better. Quickly. Quickly. When injury ends or inflammation ends, then the repair starts. These are the emeras that Reba Goodman showed. They do not control somatic areas, they do control survival. The applications, I think, of pulse electromagnetic field therapy are virtually endless. They cross the entire spectrum of inflammation, injury, aging, and illness. And if you think injury and illness and aging aren't the same spectrum, then you just get a bad enough injury and illness. And the output is all the same, isn't it? So if Maxwell and Einstein less so than Maxwell for sure, agreed upon this statement: electromagnetic energy controls all reactions between atoms and molecules. With pulse electromagnetic fields in over a half century use worldwide, no side effects. How many people in the United States died last year from drug-related side effects? 2.5 million. 30,000 of them died from gastric bleeding associated with non-steroidal anti-inflammatory use alone. And the government continues to allow these companies to bully and direct the decisions of FDA. And believe you me, they do direct the decisions of FDA. Well, today we know the mechanism. Now, this is one of the things that FDA used to tell us in the 80s. You don't know the mechanism. You don't know what your technology does. Today we do. And the only question I guess I need to ask FDA is, how do we get it so wrong? Why have we relied on drugs in surgery? Dr. Gabby Nindell, who's the head of bioelectromagnetics at the University of Indiana School of Medicine, at the Rocky Mountain Symposium on Bioengineering said, optimistically, we may someday look forward to the time when pulsed electromagnetic field technology will replace the pharmacologic and surgical interventions that America is tied to today. And I think that is the end of my talk. So if you have any questions, if anybody, let me quickly, the outcome on this study by NASA, not equivocal at all. Go to page 26 and 27 when you get to the site. Now make sure you go to Lyndon Johnson's center, because that's the only way you're going to get it. You can search the other 5 centers or whatever it is they have and you'll never get there. You got to go here, put in Goodwin. You can put in the technical number if you'd like to write down the technical number. I'll give it to you. It's 2003. That's this year or last year. And then it's dash 212054. And if you go into search and you do that, you can pick that off of there.
Anybody has any questions?
They found, excuse me a minute. They found in their study, and we're not equivocal about stating it, that this technology will improve tissue transplantation, will improve repair of traumatized tissue, and will improve some neurodegenerative diseases. Now, if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Yeah, we need to put down the two. If you could go back behind the podium, because that mic you're wearing is not forward. Thank you.
We've heard a lot in the past about Rife technology. How does this compare to Rife technology?
The Rife technology is an older technology. Mr. or Dr. Rife, I never had the pleasure to meet him, was a genius. He was harassed, he was persecuted by the American Medical Association, Morris Fishbein to be exact, because Fishbein actually saw his technology as something very valuable in the 1930s, attempted to extort him out of that technology, then promised to destroy him and his technology, and effectively did among organized medicine. He paid this man in federal court a couple of $1 million for doing that to him, but Rife never recovered from it. I don't know if anybody that likes the Rife technology was aware of that story, but that in fact did happen. And Fishbein, who was the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, was the guy that was prosecuted in that thing.
One last question. Have you treated anyone with fibromyalgia, or do you accept that as a true disease?
I absolutely accept that as a true disease. I'd have to be blind, deaf, and dumb if I didn't. But
What is the difference between the Rife technology and your technology?
well, the Rife technology is an old technology. First of all, it's a millisecond technology, and today you've got to be in nanosecond. You've got to be in nanosecond today. That's the only thing about Rife. Yes.
Robert Becker, in his studies, also did some regenerative studies where he was using direct current.
Yes.
Is there any continued research along those lines in humans where they've been able to get regeneration using the electromagnetic properties?
We're getting regeneration using electromagnetic properties, yes. This was part, if you look at this NASA study, you'll find that not only did they stimulate growth, there are 9 patents coming out of this study. And one of them was being able to grow cultures in 3-dimensional form. And so they took neurons and they literally grew well-organized, mature nerve tissue. And if you look at their electron micrographs in here, you're going to be amazed. These look like biopsies out of a brain or spinal cord, and they came out of a tubular cell culture 3-dimensional thing. You really want to look at this study. This study is the watershed study for the world.
The second question would be, one of the things that you see in the world of healing is people who use Reiki, hand types of healings. Have you been able to, or has the field been able to document an electromagnetic interaction from one human to another human, where rather than using machine to impose these frequencies, you're actually using another human being to impose a healing frequency on another human being?
Well, I have a phenomenologic sense about that. And if phenomenology, anybody aware of? Phenomenology is how you view occurrences that you may not be able to explain by scientific method. Phenomenologically, we know that there are current flows in the human body. We know surrounding current flows there are electromagnetic fields, and there are people who do measure these electromagnetic fields at the surface of the human body. Now, if one living frequency could affect another living human frequency, I would think there would be a certain compatibility to that relationship that we're unable to manufacture artificially. Now, it may or may not be the case, but there's also, one of the things I was telling some people last evening, it's funny how this thing about 12 hours, we knew in the 1800s, when they'd stand at the door and the little kid had pneumonia, and the doctor would look at the father and say, "We'll know in the morning." We knew that. We knew that. The science just hadn't arrived there yet. Today we do. It's interesting, there's another expression about, I roll up against my wife when I'm sick because I know she makes me feel better. How many wives and husbands do you know that say the same thing? My daughter is a Reiki practitioner. She can, so help me God, she can put her hands on my body when I'm hurt and when I feel bad. And she makes me feel as good as that technology does. And I have spent 25 years and a few $1 million bringing that technology on board, and it was pure happenstance on a Christmas night that my daughter came on board. And so I think it's there. I think it's just going to take some dedication, some commitment to try and determine what it is that happens. But phenomenologically, I have to say, I'm not going to question it.
Might it be that your scientific approach to coming up with a reason or modality for this technology, so that we can see with a scientific reproducible basis that will actually increase our faith in the most effective modality, which is a human-to-human interaction?
Well, you may be right. And the interesting thing is, we started out with hundreds of Gauss, thousands of Gauss technologies. We're getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until we're getting down very close to what the human field appears to be. Technologies of 70 milligauss is not really a whole lot of field strength, is it? So I think you may have something. I don't know.
Dr. Becker also did work with oxygen, showing the effect of in the presence of plentiful oxygen, that cancer cells will go away, basically. You talked about the free radical association with the oxygen. You have the free radical associated oxygen, and then you have the non-free radical oxygen. Have you been able to demonstrate the role of oxygen and deep breathing, for example, and the lymphatic system in accentuating the healing process?
We have not.
Okay.
We have not. It is not that I don't think it happens. We just have not. In research, you have to stay within your field of definition. Yes, sir.
I have a couple questions. First one, in the technology that most of us are familiar with, Nikola Tesla, John Searle, and Henry Murray all had therapeutic devices that were using the pulse technology to create an ether field, and it was the ether field that was doing the healing. Have you studied this at all?
The ether field?
Yeah, it's kind of a wave of non-electrical energy that comes out of these devices, and that's what they were finding did the healing.
I think my physicist says it in a little different way than that. My physicist says, our circuit's good enough that we don't get a lot of electrical leak out of our circuit. We are projecting a near-field magnetic flux. And this guy was a senior scientist for National Semiconductor, a senior scientist for Comcast. He knows of which he speaks. He has a PhD in physics from Cornell and a master's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Washington. And as I said, has served as senior circuit scientist for 2 different major corporations. And he believes that this is principally, that may be what they saw as the ether I don't know.
No, it's very different than that.
It is. Well, then I don't know anything about it.
The second question, I've been in the vitamin and mineral industry for some time, and I'm finding the government is highly suppressing it, and and the deficiencies of vitamins and minerals is also a very leading reason for all of our health problems. Have you looked into that?
Well, just as you have there, it's my personal opinion, and I agree with you, but that's the end of, I mean, I don't have any further comment to make about that.
Thank you.
I only have one question. I heard that stress can create more free radicals than usual. I just want to know if that is true or not.
Wonderful analysis. You're absolutely correct. What stress does is stress takes that normal aging and raises that time-varying equilibrium. You can still make a time-varying equilibrium under stress. It raises that time-varying equilibrium up much closer to that illness line. As a matter of fact, when we made that graph, which is purely illustrative, there's nothing scientific about the graph, it's purely illustrative. When we made that graph, I was actually going to put a stress graph in there. Excellent. That's an excellent analysis, and that does happen. Anytime you put a mitochondrion under load or excessive demand, it will form free radicals. You can just take that to the bank. And so if you're under stress all the time, you're going to put that mitochondrion under greater load, and it in fact will liberate more free radicals. Good analysis.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Glen, one of the descriptions of free radicals that may not have been clarified in your presentation is perhaps something like chlorine, which you find in the organic chemistry textbooks as a molecule that disassociates at human warm temperatures when you take a shower, for example, in chlorinated water.
Right.
And the fact that I'm offering to you is just the simple conception that these atoms or molecules are looking for electrons. Dr. Jim Oshman, the author of Energy Medicine, and also myself, author of Bioelectromagnetic Healing, have now agreed, and we're pursuing research at the University of Pennsylvania on simply showing that if you use high voltage, in addition to the pulsed EMF, you can then satisfy the free radicals directly with the electron flow. So perhaps the modality you're describing, the mechanism, may be a little bit simpler if you have high voltage available. Such as Lukovsky type machines and so forth.
The interesting thing is that when lymphocytes are called in, under chemoattractant gradient, are called into a site, as you know, they actually secrete hypochlorite. That's one of the ways, this stuff all started to kill bacteria when bacteria were killing all of us. And they believe that was the evolution for the free radical, probably. Who knows? But in any case, lymphocytes do actually secrete Clorox, hypochlorite. It's amazing to think that in a living system, something as explosive as that could really be secreted, but it is.
But as far as satisfying free radical scavenging, that wouldn't necessarily provide an electron excess.
I didn't hear your last statement.
Your example doesn't seem to answer my question. But
well, I guess
we can talk about it afterwards, perhaps.
Yeah, that'll be fine. I certainly, what I spoke about were naturally occurring free radicals.
Right.
I don't think there are naturally occurring and in the constitutive stage. I mean, I argue this all the time when we talk about protocols. I have a protocol going with the Department of Defense. I want it to be an acute, in-field. We're using this device. This is our device that we're going to use in that study. I mean, these troops can carry it on their belt. If they get shot anywhere but in the stomach, well, even then they could. But I mean, they can take this thing out immediately, throw the switch, and they can begin to get pain relief and treat themselves. Now, based upon what this doctor said, you have to keep your parameters confined. I mean, I can't treat an injury that's 24 hours old and be treating the same injury that I wanted to treat when it was 10 minutes old. And so when I talk about free radicals, I'm talking about constitutive, secretory, naturally occurring free radicals. Are there other free radicals? Absolutely, no question about it. Can they be created by high current flow? Yes. Can they be created by combustion? Yes. I mean, there are a number of different ways to create destructive electron scavengers. A number of different ways. Yes?
Did you say that the LED technology was pretty worthless then, or was it
Worthless?
or do you get some of the same results?
I don't think that was the word I used, but you know, since you forced it on me, no, I don't know. I mean, we did an awful lot of studying, and boy, believe me, I was an aficionado of low-level lasers. But you know, when people that are a whole heck of a lot smarter than you are begin to tell you, Glenn, you can't, you know, come on, think a minute, and then prove it to you, well, you know, then if you don't do it, you're not a scientist, you're stupid. And so that was in 1984. Now Ron Wynett, who's at FDA, to get around a lot of this, took fiber optics, and he'd go through a needle and literally insert this fiber optic through the skin. See, if you can avoid the skin proteins and things like that, then maybe you're doing something. But it's invasive and whatever. He got in there and I said, well, Ron, how far have you been able to measure this photobiologic effect? Now, this is the skin of rats, which is not as complex as the skin in humans is. He said, well, we can measure changes in hemoglobin about 1/4 centimeter away. Okay. End of my conversation, you know. Okay, Ron, okay. I mean, what's that got to do with therapy? See, that's what I'm saying. I mean, you know, you got to get some penetration down. That's all I can think of. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Glenn, this is an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
When you mentioned the catalyst effect to magnify the antioxidant reactions, did you do any work to control the antioxidant load? Were you doing any type of controlled supplementation, or just looking at that in general for where were like the low limits versus high limits for efficacy related to antioxidant availability?
It wasn't my work. It was Eichwald's work at Stanford. What he and his group did is I think they basically measured this in a spin resonance environment. And I'm certain, I can't speak for him, but you know, think about it. I mean, here you're at Stanford University, you've got all these wonderfully complex machines like, you know, spin resonance capacity and everything else. I'm sure they very strictly must have controlled their antioxidant load, their free radical load, and everything else. I just couldn't imagine them doing otherwise. And they are also an incredibly rigorous group. I mean, you know, they do all of their stuff to Stanford level of scientific endeavor.
Okay.
So that's all I can say. We didn't do it. We didn't have the money. In 1984, 85, and 86, we came into the NIH and asked for grant money. And in 1984, 85, and 86, FDA told them to deny us. We were not alone. They told them to deny everybody that wanted to. I mean, there was a guy named Wise Young at NYU, PhD, MD, wonderful scientist, did excellent work. They turned him down 3 years in a row too, bang, bang, bang. Yes, sir.
You stated earlier that some neurological disorders are responsive to this electromagnetic pulse technology, and specifically Parkinson's disease. And I was wondering, other disorders such as attention deficit disorder, bipolar disorder, are any of these responsive? Could you be a little more specific on that?
Well, the Israelis, I didn't even want to go there, but the Israelis, and in Paris, and to a lesser degree, and including the University of Washington, there are now scientists in the United States that are studying bipolar disorders and depression, whether they're studying attention deficit disorder. I think if they were treating children in this way, I think there would be an outrage in the United States. It's outrageous what they're doing now. It would be an even greater outrage if they did it to children. They're taking these old low-field MRI units that have a 20,000 Tesla field, a 20,000 Gauss field, 2 Tesla fields, and they're setting them at a 4 hertz frequency, and they're treating people with depression and bipolar disorders with this. The Israelis tell me that when they turn that unit on, these people say they sense bam, 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 like that when that pulse hits them. I've not been there, but you know, there have been no safety studies done with this. There have been No outcome studies done with this. All everybody says is, well, it's better than electroconvulsive therapy. Well, let me tell you a story about that. If I promise not to shoot you, do you mind if I rob you of all your money? That's the only answer I can tell.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Mike?
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, and we'll start again at 9:30.